Number 11. Gorilla on Mars. British tabloids decided it would be a fun idea to stir readers' imaginations in early 2016 when numerous publications featured what they claimed was a photo of a gorilla living on Mars. Captured by NASA's Curiosity rover in 2004, the photo drew little attention until it appeared in a YouTube video posted by a user known only as Mr. Enigma. From there, the claims appeared in far-flung headlines courtesy of mainstream media, adding the so-called gorilla to a growing list of animals people claim to have identified in pictures of the Red Planet. Extraterrestrial enthusiasts reportedly spend hours scouring images from space, looking for anything they can correlate with an Earth-like creature. Some people even believed that the image of the suspected primate also featured a camel, while others suggested that the pair looked like a mother bear and her cub. The outlandish belief that the animals we're familiar with here on Earth could also exist on Mars took off like wildfire. But a closer look at Mr. Enigma's other YouTube videos, which contain claims that he spotted an octopus, an Egyptian statue, and other out-of-place items on the Red Planet, begs the possibility that the content was created by someone who simply has too much time on their hands, spending their days staring at pictures of rock formations until they see something that looks like an animal or an earthly object. Other conspiracy theorists have claimed to spot crabs, lizards, bears, rabbits, and more in photos of the Martian surface. As always, mainstream scientists stand by their claims that these are nothing more than rocks. Number 10. Face on Mars. In 1976, a photo captured in the Cydonia region of Mars sparked international headlines for containing what looks like a human face protruding from the surface. Scientists knew early on that the formation was merely a pile of rocks that gained its eerily human-like appearance through lights and shadows, but that's not a very exciting story. So, of course, as they do, people took their more imaginative ideas and ran with them. As conspiracy theorists clung to their denial that the object was naturally formed, they proposed numerous explanations for the object's origins. The most general argument claims that the face is evidence of life on Mars, while a more specific claim alleges that it is a remnant of an alien civilization, and that nearby rock formations are actually destroyed buildings that once made up a village. Sounds insane, right? Both NASA and the European Space Agency took more detailed pictures of the face and concluded, not surprisingly, that their original analysis of it was correct. The face is nothing more than some rocks that the light is hitting in just the right way to make them look like a person. In other words, it's an optical illusion. Number 9. Screaming Skull. Captured in the year 2000 by NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory, this X-ray image depicts what appears to be a demonic flaming face. Known as the Perseus Cluster, it's actually just a collection of thousands of galaxies located 320 million light-years from Earth, which are spread throughout a 100,000 light-year span. Oddly enough, none of the galaxies are visible in the bizarre photo. Instead, the image features a massive 50 million degree cloud of intracluster gas that's bigger than all the galaxies combined, according to NASA's Astronomy Picture of the Day blog. Voids and bright knots within the cloud are what give the picture its skull-like appearance. Scientists believe that there's a supermassive black hole at the center of the Perseus cluster. The dark bubbles forming the skull's eyes and toothless mouth likely resulted from explosions of energy particles that were ejected from the black hole. The brighter white-hued areas represent more intense X-ray radiation, while weaker radiation is responsible for the dimmer red shades. Number 8. Ghost Nebula. Located 1,470 light-years away within the Cepheus constellation in the northern sky, the Ghost Nebula, SH2136, also known as the Ghosts of Cepheus, is a cloud of interstellar dust which is also known as a reflection nebula. It can also be classified as a globule, which is a dark cloud of gas and dust illuminated by the light of nearby stars. Measuring over 2 light-years across, the Ghost Nebula contains several new stars, which give it a brownish hue. The globule is best known for its ghastly appearance, resembling a collection of ghosts trying to escape from some invisible force. There's also a Ghost Head Nebula, NGC 2080, which is named for 2 white patches it contains called the Eyes of the Ghost. Located 168,000 light-years away in the Milky Way, there's a satellite galaxy known as the Large Magellanic Cloud. It's both a star-forming region and an emission nebula, which is formed from ionized gases. As you'll learn throughout today's video, these are not the only spooky space objects that look like ghosts. Number 7. A Martian Human. For centuries, people have entertained and obsessed over the idea that there could be life on Mars. So naturally, when NASA released images of what appears to be a person on the red planet's surface in 2008, believers saw it as solid evidence that they were right all along. Some even speculated that the individual was alive when the pictures were taken. But scientists offered the far more rational, albeit boring explanation that the human-like figure is nothing more than a rock. They argued that this is just another example of people seeing shapes and objects in clouds, foods, and other things. Writing for Space.com, science blogger Benjamin Radford argued that the fact that people interpreted the object as a human supports the idea that a psychological phenomenon is at play, rather than valid scientific evidence of Martian life. Meanwhile, Radford explained, people failed to perceive other rock formations as possible life forms, even though they could have easily done so, with some of them resembling armadillos, snakes, and other non-human creatures. Astronomer Phil Plait pointed out that the rock in the photo is just a few inches tall, essentially proving that there's no person in the picture. This is a classic example of the human mind's tendency to play tricks on itself and for people to see what they want to see, even when all signs point toward their interpretation being wrong. Do you think there's life somewhere on Mars? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. The Great Pumpkin. On October 30th, 2015, the day before Halloween, NASA scientists captured this image of asteroid 2015 TB-145 as it passed by Earth from roughly 480,000 kilometers away. Nicknamed the Great Pumpkin and the Halloween asteroid, this 2,100-foot, skull-shaped mass is believed to be a dead comet. It was discovered just weeks before its Halloween flyby, which is the closest known approach by such a large object. That is, until the 2,600-foot asteroid 1999 AN-10 passes by in 2027 from 238,000 miles away. The Great Pumpkin completes a rotation roughly every 3 hours and only reflects 5 to 6% of the sunlight that hits it, according to Space.com. It's only slightly more reflective than charcoal, says astrophysicist Pablo Santos Sanz, who co-authored a study on the ghoulish object. Completing a trip around the sun every 3 years, the Halloween asteroid has a unique oblong orbit but poses no impact threats to the Earth. In other words, it only looks scary with its uncanny resemblance to a human cranium. Number 5. Jackolantern Son. In an eerie coincidence that happened as Halloween 2014 approached, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory captured an image of the sun that looked like an illuminated jack-o'-lantern. The giant star's brightly lit active regions are responsible for the festive characteristics, which resemble the eyes, nose, and crooked mouth that are typical of a carved pumpkin. The image's orange color was created by blending 2 sets of wavelengths, including the 171 angstrom extreme ultraviolet light that appears yellow and the 193 angstrom light, which has a muted gold hue. These wavelengths cannot be seen by the naked eye, so it would be impossible to simply look at the sun, which is a bad idea anyway, and get the same results. A 2019 Sci-Tech Daily article clarifying the facts about the picture pointed out that the shapes we see in the Jackolantern Sun are similar to how we look at clouds and interpret them as looking like various objects, a psychological tendency known as pareidolia. So, does the sun have any real connection with Halloween, especially considering the timing of when the image was captured? No, but the coincidences are both creepy and entertaining. Number 4. A menacing face. When astronomers examined a Hubble Space Telescope image captured in late 2019, they were met by what looked like a pair of ghoulish, glowing eyes staring right back at them. Of course, this had nothing to do with the supernatural, but was the product of 2 galaxies colliding deep in space. The eyes represent the galaxy's cores, and a ring of young blue stars form what looks like the outline of a face. Officially cataloged as ARP Mador 2026-424, the intergalactic crash is a rare example of galaxies crashing into one another head-on. The impact caused their gas, dust, and stars to stretch outward, forming the ring of young stars. There are only a few hundred known ring galaxies, which are formed when a collision occurs at a very specific angle, according to Sci-Tech Daily. It'll take roughly 1 to 2 billion years for the 2 galaxies to fully merge. The crash is also unique because the galaxies appear to be approximately the same size. Typically, these encounters involve large galaxies consuming smaller ones. By studying how galaxies interact with one another, scientists hope to learn more about how galactic mergers cause them to grow over time. Number 3. Alien shares. In recent years, scientists have increasingly turned their attention towards strange dark spots that dot the surface of Venus. These unexplained splotches, which change over time, were discovered over a century ago, but we still don't know what they are. Some researchers have suggested that they could be a sign of life on the planet. In a 2019 study, experts conceded that all the possibilities they entertained failed to explain what the spots could be made of or what their properties were. The spots contain particles that all appear to be the same size and behave like microorganisms that exist on Earth. Furthermore, scientists determined that between 2006 and 2017, the amount of light the planet absorbs from the light that hits it, known as the albedo, was reduced by half and then began increasing again. These changes were accompanied by a similar reduction in how much solar energy clouds absorbed, directly impacting the amount of circulation in the Venusian atmosphere. Researchers are at a loss to explain the causes behind these dramatic changes, but they believe the strange dark spots may play a role, and even highly respected scientists have gotten on board with the idea that they could contain living organisms. Number 2. Witchhead Nebula. In keeping with its theme of featuring festive images around Halloween, in 2013 NASA published a photo of what looks like the side profile of a screaming witch's face. Captured 900 light-years from Earth by the agency's WISE infrared space telescope, the object in question is actually a collection of baby stars that illuminate the surrounding cloud of dust, giving the formation its seemingly wicked appearance. Known as a reflection nebula like we mentioned earlier, the witch's head is located near the knee of the Orion constellation, hundreds of light-years from Earth. Officially filed under the name IC2118, it cannot be seen by the naked eye and can only be viewed through a telescope thanks to reflected starlight, according to the Lowell Observatory. The brightest star in the Orion constellation and the seventh brightest star in the night sky, dubbed Regal, is largely responsible for lighting up the witch's head. Scientists believe that the nebula is likely the remnant of a massive star explosion known as a supernova, which occurs at the very end stages of a star's life. Like several other examples on today's list, our interpretation of the image reflects a psychological phenomenon called pareidolia, which happens when the human brain recognizes shapes and objects in unrelated pictures. Number 1. Eye of Sauron. Located in the constellation Piscis Austrinus, Fomalhaut is a bright star with at least one planet dubbed Fomalhaut b circulating it. Since its discovery in 2005, Fomalhaut b's strange orbit has perplexed scientists who are also curious about why the regions around the star are populated by large numbers of comets, according to Space.com. At roughly 440 million years old, Fomalhaut is much younger than our 4.5 billion-year-old Sun. It has a surface temperature of around 14,840 degrees Fahrenheit and is the 18th brightest star in the sky. Scientists first suspected that there was a planet orbiting Fomalhaut back in 2002. 3 years later, they captured Fomalhaut b in this eerie image reminiscent of the Eye of Sauron, a reference from The Lord of the Rings. For those who are unfamiliar with the trilogy, it's clear that the image looks like a giant, evil-looking red eye. Researchers claimed that this was the first time anyone had taken a picture of a planet in visible light, while skeptics argued that the image was not necessarily a planet, but perhaps it featured a dust cloud. The inability of NASA's Spitzer Space Telescope to capture a picture of it supported this idea. A 2012 study put the debate to rest by proving that Fomalhaut b is in fact a planet. That same year, scientists discovered a massive swarm of up to 83 trillion comets lurking near the Fomalhaut system. Every day, thousands of the comets collide and are destroyed, according to study leader Bram Ack. Fomalhaut's system also contains an unusually high amount of dust, which researchers believe is formed by comet collisions. The materials have a mass equivalent to roughly 110 Earths. Number 10. Inca Rituals. Archaeologists recently discovered a mysterious artifact at the bottom of Lake Titicaca in Peru. This lake was once a sacred place in the Inca Empire, making it an attractive spot to look for historical or spiritual artifacts. While doing an underwater survey of the lake, an international team of researchers discovered just that. They found an offering box crafted from volcanic stone. This was found 18 feet, 5.5 meters beneath the surface. The box sat undisturbed there for 500 years. But just what was this thing used for? It's important to note that Lake Titicaca was the religious center of the Great Inca. At its height in the 16th century, there were over 80 temples and structures on the southern part of the lake, near what is called the Island of the Sun. The Inca believed it was here that the sun god was born and their ancestors emerged from the rock to claim the earth. It's only natural that the Inca spent time by the lake to be close to their spiritual birthplace and continued to give offerings to their gods. Specifically, the Inca gave offerings to the goddess Mamacocha. She was the goddess of fertility, politics, and the sea. The box discovered recently by archaeologists was made to contain offerings probably for this goddess. Within the box was a miniature alpaca carved out of coral shell, and while hard to confirm, researchers also believe there may have been the blood of sacrificed children inside the box as well before it was tossed into the lake. What do you think? It's certainly possible, but we just don't know yet for sure what went on there. More research is needed. Number 9. Mummified Diver. A man's body has been discovered 225 feet deep under the surface of Lake Michigan. While it's not that strange for bodies to be recovered in the lake, this one was unique. The body belonged to a diver who went missing 13 years prior. His corpse was found preserved and mummified thanks to the cold temperature of the water, the immense pressure near the bottom, and the obvious lack of oxygen. He was found still wearing his diving gear with his air tank still securely fastened. The mystery of the vanished diver goes back to September of 1999 when Dirk Cann went diving in Whitefish Bay. He was with two of his buddies on that fateful day. They were planning to explore an old steamer that sank in the lake back in 1924 carrying a load of classic cars. But something went wrong. Khan's friend experienced an issue with his air tank, and the two men were forced to share from a single source of air. But it wasn't enough, and as they rose to the surface, Khan passed out from a lack of oxygen and sank to the bottom, where he drowned. It took 13 years for them to find his body, which most people would expect to have decomposed and turned into a skeleton. Because of the mummification, though, it looks like it's hardly aged a day. I know I'd be creeped out by something like that, wouldn't you? Number 8. Mysterious new shark. A species of shark was found just off the coast of Belize, named the Atlantic six-gill shark. The identification of the new beast was made by scientists working with the Florida Institute of Technology. The shark was first identified about 2 years ago. Researchers found a curious, kind of adorable shark swimming about 800 feet deep. At first, they thought it was a big-eye six-gill shark, which are spread throughout the world and often found at extreme depths, meaning scientists don't know a lot about them. It wasn't until researchers captured 30 of the sharks near Belize and did genetic analysis that they realized they were dealing with an entirely different species, one that specifically lives around Belize. According to researchers, even though both sharks look very similar, the research shows that they are vastly different. In fact, the Atlantic six-gill shark is surprisingly small, only growing to be about 6 feet, 1.8 meters long. One thing they can't quite figure out is why these sharks have 6 gills instead of the usual 5. Their ancestors date back at least 250 million years, making Atlantic six-gill sharks far older than most of the sharks on the planet. Why they evolved to be so different is still quite the mystery. Number 7. Plane crash wreckage. We all know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of mysterious unsolved plane crashes or missing aircraft out there somewhere. Many of them fell into the ocean back in the early days of aviation. But even today, there are some rare occasions where airplanes simply go missing. It may take many years, but sometimes the mystery does get solved thanks to technology. This is one of those times where a mysterious plane crash from 1965 may have just been discovered thanks to an underwater drone. This aviation mystery goes back 56 years to when a 4-seater plane crashed somewhere in the area around Folsom Lake and was never seen again. For a long time, nobody knew what happened to the airplane. The pilot's body was discovered on the ground after the catastrophic failure on New Year's Day, but the airplane and the other 3 passengers seemingly vanished into thin air. Now, a giant chunk of wreckage was found by new sonar mapping technology at the bottom of Folsom Lake. The images taken of the wreckage exactly match the plane that crashed in 1965. Unfortunately for those who went to investigate the evidence in person, it sank to the deepest part of the lake, under about 160 feet water. To get this thing out of the lake will be quite the battle. Then on top of that, there's the issue of recovering the skeletons of the deceased, assuming they're still strapped in their seats. Number 6. Secret underwater city. Archaeologist Mate Parica was checking out satellite images of the Croatian coastline when he spotted something strange. Parica is a professor at the University of Zadar. He's not just some internet dweller looking for hidden secrets on Google Earth. He found a shallow area on the seabed that appeared to have traces of ancient ruins. So he went with a colleague to the place on the map with scuba gear and dove down to check it out. What he found was a lost Neolithic settlement that he believes dates back 6,500 years to 4,500 BC. The settlement was built on a small piece of land that was once connected to the mainland, but sank thousands of years ago. Could this be one of the inspirations for the legend of Atlantis? It's possible that many different ancient peoples had stories of sunken cities passed down by word of mouth, and as they became connected, those legends merged into the tale of Atlantis. What do you think? And as for what the professor found down here, he located the remains of stone walls, ancient stone tools, and other everyday objects used by the ancient people. He even found ceramic objects, which is pretty amazing considering how old the settlement is. Another thing that makes the discovery so strange is that scientists are not aware of any other settlement in the area that dates back so far. It's as if an ancient people built a primitive city on the small island and then vanished for unknown reasons, while the other humans in the area were still living in caves. Number 5. The Shinkokumaru. The wreckage of the Shinkokumaru is one of the creepiest things currently rotting away at the bottom of Truk Lagoon. The ship was crafted in 1939 and then converted during the Second World War by the Japanese Navy into a fleet oiler. This menacing vessel participated in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, but was later torpedoed by a United States submarine in August of 1942. Then, during Operation Hailstone, when the U.S. crushed a huge part of the Japanese Navy at Truk Lagoon, the ship sank along with the rest of the fleet. Today, this creepy vessel is about 125 feet below the surface and can only be reached with special diving equipment. Apart from the coral and sea life that now occupies it, the ship is exactly as it was before being sunk, complete with a creepy bathtub and all the other equipment that was on board over 75 years ago. Have you ever gone diving to see any sunken ships? Where? What did you find? Was it scary? Tell me about it in the comments down below. Then remember to subscribe to American Eye if you haven't already for more exciting videos just like this one. Number 4. Lost Civilization. A group of Native Americans, none of whom were credentialed scientists, may have just discovered evidence of a culture from the Ice Age that lived 10,000 years ago, submerged beneath the Straits of Mackinac. That's right, they stumbled upon it unintentionally. The discovery came when the group used a remotely operated underwater vehicle to take a look at the natural gas pipelines underwater at the bottom of the lake. But way more interesting than the pipelines was the collection of stones found on the lakebed arranged in a circular pattern like an ancient stone circle. The stones had obviously been placed strategically by hand, but how could that have been possible? The stone circle is at the bottom of a lake. The only thing that makes sense is that some prehistoric culture put the stones there before the lake was filled with water, meaning before the Ice Age ended. They haven't actually managed to go down there and look yet for artifacts. Still, the group is certain something cool is waiting for them at the bottom of the lake. It's unclear which culture is responsible for the stone circle or what kind of other structures may be hidden. But one thing's for sure. A group of ancient people definitely lived in the area, perhaps a civilization previously unknown to science. Number 3. Medieval Warrior. A medieval soldier has been found at the bottom of a lake in Lithuania, still equipped with his weapons of war. The skeleton of this warrior was discovered during an underwater inspection of a local bridge. The researchers were shocked when they found the decomposed body of a person poking out of the sand, along with his rusted sword and a pair of knives. According to archaeologist Elena Prankenite, there were no signs that the man was buried. Instead, his corpse had simply been tossed into the lake and gradually covered over with sand and silt. Here's what we know so far. The warrior died in the 16th century, though no cause of death has been reported. Judging by the artifacts found near the body, he had a high military status. He's also the first soldier corpse ever to be found underwater in the country of Lithuania. One of the theories as to how he got there is that he fell off the bridge in ancient times, because back in the 16th century, there had been a much older bridge leading across the lake to a castle. The warrior may have been on his way to or from the castle when he either stumbled off the bridge and drowned, or he could have been stabbed in the back and thrown over. Number 2. Hitler's Gold. Depending on who you ask, there's a treasure of Nazi gold at the bottom of a Polish lake. Explorer Peter Kopper has been looking for the gold for years. He now believes that he's located it. The only trouble he's having is getting to the bottom of the lake to reach his treasure. There's been a legend ever since World War II that a Nazi convoy filled with gold and stolen art was lost in 1945 after setting off from the nearby city of Görlitz. The trucks left the city and were never seen again. Many believe they ended up at the bottom of a lake, but nobody could say which one. Now, Peter has used a special radar to look deep into an undisclosed lake about 90 miles from Görlitz. The radar revealed a large steel object which could be one of the trucks stacked to the ceiling with gold. The only thing he needs to do now is dive down and get it, which is easier said than done. It'll cost him a fortune to organize the expedition, and in the end, there may not even be any gold there. If you were Peter, would you spend time trying to find the gold, even if there was the risk of turning up nothing? Or would you ignore it as a ridiculous daydream? Let me know in the comments down below. Number 1. Ancient Obsidian. A team of underwater archaeologists have discovered stone tools at the bottom of Lake Huron that date back 9,000 years. Researchers with the University of Texas at Arlington were the ones to find the artifacts, which they say came from an obsidian quarry roughly 2,000 miles from the lake in the middle of Oregon. These tools are the oldest things crafted from obsidian anywhere in the eastern United States. But the tools themselves aren't the most interesting part of the mystery here. 9,000 years ago, bringing stone tools this far was quite a feat. Archaeologists are suggesting that the stone tools are proof of an extensive trade network across North America even before the first American city was ever built. Obsidian remained a precious trading material for thousands of years because of its sharpness. Obsidian is volcanic glass and it's really great at cutting. But before now, researchers hadn't imagined that there was a trading route dating back so far. There was likely a quarry somewhere in Oregon which traded the obsidian to a roaming band of early humans, who then traded it to whomever was living in Lake Huron before it was a lake, and these ancient unknown people then left behind their broken obsidian tools for archaeologists to find today. Number 10. Munitions Workers. One of the most dangerous and critical jobs from World War I was being a munitions worker. These brave people supplied troops who were battling on the front lines with equipment and ammunition to take down the enemy. During the First World War, a large portion of munitions workers were female, as this freed up more men to be shipped to the battlefield. By the end of the war, there were an estimated 700,000 female munition workers called munitionettes. But it wasn't exactly a fun job. These people worked incredibly long hours and in extremely dangerous conditions. TNT poisoning was a serious hazard. Because munitions workers were filling shells with dangerous chemicals, they'd often get too much exposure to TNT and it would turn their skin yellow. When this happened, they would be called canaries. Plus, the factories themselves were very dangerous. Poor ventilation, asbestos, consistent exposure to harmful chemicals, and back-breaking labor. Number 9. Trench warfare. The men in the trenches battling throughout World War I had what you might think of as the worst job in the entire world. Not only in the war, but pretty much anywhere ever. Trenches were dug as deep ditches, mostly along the Western Front, where German troops and Allied forces battled to gain territory. Trenches have been around in warfare for as long as time, but before World War I, trenches were never actually used before to this extent in armed combat. World War I, also known as the Great War, saw a wide use of trenches being dug into the ground by infantry soldiers who would live inside of them for weeks at a time, relatively protected from the fire of machine guns and artillery attacks raining down from up above. Trenches were hazardous for a few reasons. First of all, chemical warfare and poisonous gas. Gas would sometimes be wafted into trenches, filling them like fog rolling through the city streets. There was also a lot of fighting. Infantry units mounted their attacks from inside the trenches with rifles and bayonets, charging headfirst into no man's land, the area in the middle of the two opposing forces. This often resulted in huge casualties, and whichever force made it to the other side of no man's land and entered the enemy trenches, then it became a brutal and bloody struggle. To give you an idea of just how deadly trench warfare was, look at the Battle of Somme in France. According to History.com, British troops suffered a total of 60,000 deaths during the first few hours of fighting on day 1. Number 8. War dogs. This one kind of breaks our hearts. In World War I, the dogs fought just as hard as the humans. Dogs actually played an extremely critical role and had numerous duties throughout the fighting. One of the most important jobs was guard dog. Just like your dog will guard your house today from intruders, dogs would be used by soldiers on guard duty since they were often a little better at spotting intruders. Secondly, German shepherds were used as casualty dogs during the war. They were trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. They would have medical equipment strapped to their backs to help the soldiers heal themselves or to allow nearby soldiers to act as doctors. But almost more important than carrying the medical supplies, these casualty dogs would keep soldiers company while they lay in pain on the battlefield, often being their only source of comfort in their final minutes alive. Unfortunately for the dogs, though, the enemy still saw them as enemy soldiers and would often shoot them dead given the opportunity. The dogs on the front lines were in just as much danger as the men in the trenches. How do you feel about dogs in battle? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. Number 7. The Wiring Party. Being a member of a wiring party in World War I was often a death sentence. These men would creep out of the trenches into no man's land, the desolate space between the Allies and the Germans. The job was one which obviously needed to be done in strict secrecy and silence. They would do so under the cover of darkness to insert wiring posts ahead of the front trench. These posts were about 6 feet, 1.8 meters tall, and had to be hammered into the ground with a mallet or a giant screw-like contraption. Once the posts were placed, wire needed to be tied between them to create fences. The wire fences would prevent enemies from throwing grenades directly into the trench where the soldiers were. This was a huge issue because if enemies could get close enough to the trenches, they could just throw grenades in and blow apart all the soldiers. But putting up the wire was very deadly work. At night, the enemy would fire flares to illuminate the battlefield. If any unfortunate soldiers were caught in the open, they would be cut down by machine gun fire. Where the distance between the enemy front lines was narrow, which was actually very often the case on the trenches of the Western Front, it wasn't unusual for wiring parties of either side to encounter men from the opposing line doing the same job. When this happened, hand-to-hand fighting would often ensue. Number 6. Aviators. When the war broke out in 1914, aviation was in its infant stages. The First World War saw a significant advancement in aircraft warfare. During the first months of the war, airplanes were mostly used by the British as reconnaissance. But as technology advanced very rapidly, planes evolved to join the battle. Pilots would drop bombs from their aircrafts and they would shoot down other enemy planes. Because soldiers were fighting in trenches, it was almost impossible for them to see what the enemy was doing. This meant aircrafts were needed to fly over enemy territory and photograph the situation behind enemy lines. These pictures were critical for the commanders to make the maps of what was going on. But obviously, the enemy didn't like this. Reconnaissance airplanes ended up being targeted by other reconnaissance airplanes and machine guns on the ground. This was definitely not an easy job. Pilots began targeting one another and getting locked in what became known as dogfights. Each plane tried to prevent the other from getting behind enemy lines and taking photographs. There were huge casualties, and it was one of the most dangerous jobs that a person could do. Remember, these planes were open to the weather. There were a lot of biplanes and other old vehicles used, which were dangerous enough to fly without being under constant fire from enemy guns. Number 5. Battlefield medics. Battlefield medics haven't changed much in thousands of years. These brave medical officers rush into the dangerous battlefield to pick up wounded soldiers and take them back to a field dressing station, usually positioned just out of range of the enemy. And while medics were often considered out of bounds, after all, soldiers were still human on both sides, and it was generally agreed that you didn't shoot doctors in the face. They were still under constant threat while trying to evacuate injured people from the battlefield. In the heat of battle, medics could easily be mistaken for other soldiers. This was the #1 reason why it was so dangerous to be a medic. World War I saw the advancement of battlefield medics. By the end of the war, roughly 37 million troops had been killed. Treating those who had been injured was a huge task. So there were 3 working zones for medics. There was the collecting zone where the wounded would be taken from the battlefield, then the evacuating zone at the rear of the battlefield where transport vehicles could collect bodies, and finally the distributing zone, usually where the hospitals would be set up. However, there would always be an aid post very close to the main fighting trenches where the medical officers would be. If a soldier was injured and unable to move, the medic would need to perform their duties sometimes right in the middle of the fighting. Number 4. Tank crews. Tank crews in World War I had a pretty difficult time of it as well. These tanks were primitive, often reaching a top speed of only 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers an hour. Each tank had its own crew, usually consisting of 3 drivers and 4 gunners. The interior conditions were horrendous. It was hot, noisy, and tanks drove like garbage, meaning it was also extremely uncomfortable as the tank rumbled across the uneven earth. Plus, bullets were constantly smacking into the metal plating and tanks were targeted by bombs. The last thing a tank crew wanted was to be blown up inside a hot metal box. While the movies may make tanks look fun, it was anything but. Men were often sick from driving in the tanks. The conditions were so bad inside that the tanks could only make small journeys. The people inside were literally suffocating on fumes and becoming delirious from the intense heat. Communication was also tough, and the tank officer often had to walk outside just to see what was going on. Between August and November of 1918, at least 2,400 men in the tank corps were killed fighting. Number 3. Submarine crews. Submarines were even worse than tanks. Being part of a submarine crew was often a death sentence. It was also a miserable job. According to Popular Mechanics, a typical submarine back then was about 88 feet, 27 meters long, and carried a crew of 23 people. Submarines were armed with torpedoes and 88mm 3.4-inch deck guns. But submarines were in constant danger. There were underwater mines scattered almost everywhere during World War I, all throughout the waters of Europe. These were often undetectable by the submarines, and even a slight nudge would cause the sub to blow apart and the whole crew to suffer unimaginable deaths. One of the worst parts of being in a submarine, other than the claustrophobia, the intense heat from all the machines, and the horrifying knowledge of being hundreds of feet under the water, was that when something happened, everybody died. There was no escape when a submarine was damaged, which they often were. When the unthinkable happened, all the crew members went down with the ship. Number 2. Chemical fighters. Chemical fighting was the most terrifying thing that happened during World War I. The terror began on April 22, 1915. German forces along the Western Front fired over 150 tons, 300,000 pounds of devastating chlorine gas at a pair of French divisions in Belgium. It was the first major gas attack by the Germans, and it killed just about every single Allied soldier on the line. The Allied soldiers had not been expecting an attack with gas. They were actually waiting for the first wave of German troops and were beginning to get worried when there was nothing but silence. Then, a literal cloud of chlorine gas floated across no man's land and into the trenches. 4 miles, 6.4 kilometers of soldiers were decimated by the gas. It was so effective and killed soldiers so quickly that the Germans didn't even know what to do. They failed to take advantage of the attack and didn't push forward, allowing the Allies to hold position. Nobody could have imagined the truly devastating effects of using chemical warfare. The second gas attack was on April 24th against a division of Canadian fighters. It was immediately after this that France and Britain began developing their own chemical weapons and supplying their soldiers with gas masks. Still, anyone caught in chemical warfare usually died. Roughly 500,000 troops were injured by toxic gas during the war, with around 30,000 deaths. Number 1. The runner. Being a runner was one of the most perilous yet important jobs you could have during World War I. As you can imagine, communication was a bit trickier in the early 1900s. They didn't really have long-range methods of relaying messages between units. The only option was to use a telegraph, a telephone, a colored flare, or mirrors to reflect light in Morse code. They also tried to use dogs and pigeons, but these weren't always the most reliable. The best way to get a message from one place to another was to use a runner. Human runners were usually low-ranking soldiers. They were people chosen for their fitness level, along with their ability to read a map and to memorize a message. These people would be sent off in any kind of weather through some of the most dangerous areas of fighting to deliver critical information from one group to another. World War I veteran Lieutenant Alan L. Dexter was quoted in a 1931 news article saying, "With a runner, it was merely a question of how long he would last before being wounded or killed." And this was true. Runners would often have to sprint over a mile through the trenches and then out into the wilderness. And this was a dangerous thing because snipers and machine guns would try to take them out as they were running. Being a runner was basically like playing dodgeball with bullets. Thanks for watching. Which job from World War I do you think was the worst? Let me know in the comments and be sure to hit the subscribe button for more amazing historical videos.